How do I not feel ugly and unfeminine anymore? Okay, I'm laughing because something funny happened while prior to the shooting of this video, but in all seriousness, I think this is not even an individual issue. I feel like this is a societal issue that basically every female kind of has this passive debuff, right? If this was a video game. And that debuff is called you care about being ugly, right? And what are some things that make me think about this? Well, number one, in nearly all female-related subreddits, like I see questions like this, and I happen to like comedy, right? And one of the ways I consume comedy is through this pay subscription service called Dropout. And in Dropout, you may have seen the Dropout shorts on YouTube, but Dropout has this programming called Make Some Noise. And in Make Some Noise, there are many times female comedians who come to perform on the show, and it's basically like a quirky version of Whose Line Is It Anyway? And every time a female performer comes, there is a bit about, oh, but I feel ugly, right? And this happens so many times. I remember Caitlin Riley was talking about like what your family members think about your work on the internet, and then she was saying something along the lines of how her mom would be like, oh yeah, I mean, I just fear that this type of work makes you feel not pretty, right? Which is more or less in the same vein as ugly. And so this is not just in one instance this called Dropout, but also I watched the Conan O'Brien interview on his podcast, Conan O'Brien Needs a Friend, and there is a bit, I think her name was Nikki something, where she talks about she doesn't ever criticize other people because out of a fear that her worst insecurity is gonna be put on spotlight. Oh, you're gonna come after me, then I'm gonna come out after you with something that you really don't want to be called out for. And then for her, it's like being ugly because in elementary school, I'm paraphrasing heavily, but in elementary school, some kid had that kind of like rebuttal to her, right? Well, you have buck teeth and you're ugly, right? And this kind of thing impacts females in a really different way compared to men, because being a ugly man is kind of like, yeah, but you can, I mean, talking about toxic patriarchy, you still have some things that you can go for, right? Like you can be personality wise, you can be an alpha male, and you can make a lot of shit ton of money and you can make it work and blah blah blah. But following the traditional model of like toxic patriarchy, it's like when you're a woman and you're ugly, you basically have zero value to offer to anyone. You're basically worthless, and it's kind of like, oh wait, why do you even exist if you're ugly, kind of a thing, right? So this, I think, although it is an individual, I mean, you could view it as an individual problem, as in you can work on not viewing yourself as an ugly person. You can work on not viewing yourself as unfeminine. I think it's really important to recognize the role of societal pressure in the kind of like what I call the ugly epidemic, right? So with that said, if you feel ugly, it's most likely because that's how people want to raise women in the first place. The society in general wants you to be conscious of being ugly, whether you are, as long as you're a female, right? Whether you are influenced by females or males, the default programming in most societies is you have to at least care about being ugly, right? Because to men, if you are ugly, then you have no prospect in romance and like fulfilling your duties as a woman and like bearing children and getting married or some bullshit like that. And even in the realm of females, right? There is a lot of like that sister wound kind of a thing, and people talk a lot about how females feel very really like insecure and competitive against females who are like on a different scale of beauty than them. So this is nuanced stuff, but in the end, what needs to be mentioned is, yeah, you feel ugly, but number one, you're kind of supposed to, based on how society works by default, and at the same time, the people that you see on the internet, the people that you kind of ordinarily spend time watching, they are most likely pretty people. They are most likely not ugly people, because ugly people get kind of shamed into basically non-existence, right? I mean, if you look at TikTok, yeah, there are influential people who aren't really like conventionally beautiful, but you will find that in most cases it is very much the minority. If you look at the top, TikTokers, top influencers, you will find that most of them are very conventionally attractive. And so, when you look at that, and my wife and I were talking about this as well, when you look at the history of prominent female actors, you find that the standard of beauty hasn't really kind of like changed. We continue to have generation after generation of the beautiful female actors, but when it comes to the looks and the kind of overall vibe of the male actor, somewhere along the lines after of the generation of Leo DiCaprio and Brad Pitt, like prominent movie stars are not conventionally attractive, right? Like for example, many like people complained a lot about why Chris Pratt is all over the Hollywood movies, and for guys, it's okay to be jacked. It's okay to be funny. It's okay to kind of be an ordinary man. It's okay to have all of those qualities in place of being handsome. But for females, if you're not pretty, if you're not conventionally pretty, you could still make it, but it's a very statistical, minority, right? So what I'm trying to say is, your perspective may be skewed because you're so used to looking at pretty people. But if you go volunteer at people with disabilities, right? If you look at the Instagram for like the community of people who are overcoming physical challenges, you will find that there are many people with living very happy lives without fully formed faces. And although society has a lot of discrimination against ugly people, so for example, I just saw a news article about how a man who doesn't have an eye and basically has like a facial deformity because of an injury, the basically face is sewn here and has one eye. He was asked to leave a restaurant because he was making the other guests scared, right? So this is something that happens across the board, but when you look at yourself after, like, considering the option of not having an eye, when you look at yourself after having the consideration of you have no skin, on Instagram, there is a lady who who is a dog attack survivor. Basically, the dog like completely removed the skin on her face, so she has had many facial reconstruction surgery. She's living a very fulfilled life, teaching people about the impact of these types of traumatic incidents and what you can do to prevent these types of future events, right? Also, Harlequin's disease. Don't Google that. There is a person on Instagram who has Harlequin's disease, and she is also telling the world how you can have this kind of a really externally visible disability but have a very fulfilling life. So when you look at those types of content, when you compare yourself, because ugly is kind of a frame, it's a perspective, right? So when you look at that, it's not like that you want to compare yourself to these people who have had events in their life that made their faces like that in the first place. But if you find yourself feeling, oh wait, like compared to that, I'm not really that ugly, then you get to realize, right, the whole flaw in the participation of the ugly perspective in the first place. You are ranking a person's worth by what they look like, which they are born with. When it has nothing to do with their personality, it has nothing to do with their innate anything, right? But it's just a standard that exists and keeps on perpetuating itself simply because we have eyes, right? And we fall into the trap of beautiful things, beautiful people must be good, right? But it's so important to recognize this pattern and not fall into the dichotomy of ugly and pretty. But again, this isn't really the discourse around this shouldn't really be just limited to the individual, because it has so much to do with society as well. But now we talked about number one, the society's role in this, and number two, we talked about how pretty and ugly is a perspective, right? Difference, right? Like, so compared to like Leo DiCaprio, I'm ugly. But compared to like a person who doesn't have a fully formed face, I'm not like that ugly. But like, this is this analogy, like this comparison sucks. But I'm trying to point out that when you participate in this, you are participating in like people with disabilities. Oh, you're ugly. Like, you're reducing their humanhood into this one descriptor called ugly. And so it feels bad, but it's kind of intentional, right? So we described the perspective, we described the society's role. Okay, so now we come to the third part, which is your individual role in this. So how do I not feel ugly and unfeminine? And I think the important part here is the implications of being ugly and unfeminine. So when you are ugly in life, right? That means you feel something else aside from being ugly. You feel powerless. You feel less than. You feel not good enough. You feel inferior. You feel all these negative things that are closely related and are in proximity to ugly and unfeminine, but they are different feelings. So I would really encourage you to look at all the feelings that follow this train of thought of ugly. So in this train, the first car is ugly. But what are the cars that come after ugly? Well, you are ugly, therefore what? Well, you are unfeminine, therefore what? And the more you identify these things, the more you can start thinking about, but why do I view myself like that? Right? Because suppose we pick the word powerless and inferior, right? I could be pretty and powerless and inferior. I could look normal and I could not care about looks, but I could feel powerless and inferior. But why do I feel powerless and inferior, and how did that get connected to the ugliness? And backtracking this kind of lines of thought and looking at the origins of not just the ugliness, but all the follow-up thoughts that follow it, it gives you a sense of, I view myself like this because of all these extra factors. Therefore, ugly becomes an umbrella term to cover all of those feelings that I hate about myself. So the more you work on those feelings, the less ground you have to think that you are an ugly person. And I think that is the most kind of immediately meaningful activity you can do to not think of yourself, not prescribe your entire humanhood into ugly.